Keanu Reeves stood before the door of a luxurious restaurant in the city center, slightly lost in thought. It was the evening when his life took an unexpected turn, and he had no idea what would follow. Why was he here? Why were people greeting him with cold stares? Someone had made a mistake, and it was hard for him to admit. Keanu entered the restaurant, a place he had visited many times. Normally, he was greeted with smiles, and no one could believe he would choose to visit this place again. But today, something was off. The waiter standing at the door froze when his gaze met Keanu's. Everything around seemed to stop. "Is that really Keanu Reeves?" Someone whispered behind him. Something clicked in his mind. He had always been part of this world, peaceful and welcoming, but today everything felt different. The waiter walking over said, "Sorry, sir, we can't serve you." Keanu froze. What did this mean? He had always been polite, always left generous tips, but today he was being ignored. For a moment he became like a statue, unable to understand what was happening. But strangely, no one around tried to intervene. No one said a word. It was like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Keanu noticed with surprise that, the moment he crossed the restaurant threshold, a silence seemed to descend. Everything around him stood still. People sitting at tables and drinking wine didn't hide their gazes. They looked at him with admiration, but in their eyes was something more: curiosity. Keanu had always been someone who took his fame lightly, but now something had changed. Something in the air made him feel uncomfortable. Yet he continued walking to his table, hoping for the usual calm service. However, as soon as he got closer, the waiter at the entrance literally froze. He turned his gaze to Keanu, but his face showed no joy as usual. Instead of standing up with a smile and greeting, the waiter took a step back. His eyes filled with unease, and his breath seemed to become heavy. Keanu couldn't understand what was happening, but he was sure it was something wrong. The silence in the hall became even more tense. Whispers spread everywhere, as if the whole restaurant had suddenly noticed something strange. People began craning their necks, trying to see what was happening between him and the waiter. Keanu tried to ease the atmosphere with a smile. He was sure it was all a misunderstanding, just a coincidence. But the waiter, seemingly ignoring his efforts, said words that instantly froze him. "Sorry, sir, we can't serve you," the waiter said quietly, but with obvious caution. This moment felt like a punch to the stomach. Keanu seemed to be in shock, but that wasn't all. He couldn't believe his ears. His thoughts began to muddle, like in a fog. What was wrong? He was used to being treated with respect everywhere, always. He was used to the attention that always followed him. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place where he felt part of the space, where status didn't matter. But now he understood that everything had changed. Why? What had happened? Soon it became clear that the attention of the spectators in the hall had become even more wary. A few people looked at him with surprise, not hiding their curiosity. One of them even leaned against a table, phone ready. Keanu felt a growing sense of unease. Why were their gazes so strange, as if they were looking at him not as a person, but as an object that needed attention? "Are you serious?" he whispered, trying to keep his composure. But his voice betrayed uncontrolled confusion. He saw the waiter hesitate, but once again, he uttered the same words, as if they were a pre-prepared phrase. "Sir, we can't serve you." Every muscle in Keanu's body tensed. Thousands of thoughts raced through his mind. Is this really happening? He had always been in the spotlight, always at the center of attention, but he had never felt this kind of rejection. He was part of a large and open world, and now he found himself on its border, where no one seemed happy to have him there. Keanu stood frozen, but the waiter didn't rush to explain. The silence that surrounded him was suffocating. He felt as though his life had turned into a spectacle. This was not just a refusal. It was a refusal that clearly demonstrated that his status, his fame, were not welcome here. But why? Keanu wanted to ask, but his mind was empty. At that moment, the waiter suddenly stepped aside as if debating whether he should say more. A few seconds stretched out like an eternity. "We don't serve celebrities here," the waiter finally said, as if delivering a sentence, condemning Keanu to silence. There was no aggression in his words, but there were firm boundaries that left no room for disagreement, and there it was. Keanu couldn't understand how this had anything to do with him. He had made mistakes in his life, but not like this. Not mistakes that could lead to such a rejection. He wasn't ready to take it seriously, but it was being treated as a very serious reason. When the waiter delivered his last words, the room immediately came alive. Whispers, glances, and phone calls filled the space. Everyone knew who was standing in the center of the room, and everyone was waiting for an explanation. Keanu felt surrounded by this never-ending flow of words and emotions. But what was important was that, as a person, he found himself on the boundary between someone who should have been served and someone who had become an unwanted guest. For all those watching from the outside, it was a moment that could not be forgotten. Thoughts about how Keanu Reeves had ended up among those rejected raised all sorts of questions. What's happening in this world? Wondered everyone present. And Keanu, paradoxically, had become the one who found himself in a situation where his status, his fame, had led to his social isolation. Keanu stood in the center of the restaurant, like a frozen figure. Hundreds of questions were racing through his mind, but they all blurred like fog. His hands trembled slightly, but he couldn't make himself take a step. The waiter's words rang in his ears like a bell. "We don't serve celebrities here." He didn't know what to do. His heart was beating faster, and every glance he felt on him seemed to accuse him of something. He felt as though his place in this world was beginning to crumble, and no one was trying to stop it. Keanu took a step to the side and froze. Everything happening around him seemed like a dreadful nightmare that wouldn't end. He thought it might be some kind of prank that someone would come out and say, "Just kidding, Keanu." But that didn't happen. People kept looking at him, not hiding their surprise. Some even started whispering and pointing at him. An internal conflict overwhelmed Keanu. He was not inclined to public scandals, never wanting to attract excessive attention, but now he felt uncomfortable. He had always considered himself part of the regular world. People respected him not for his status, but for his simplicity and kindness. And now, standing before this restaurant, he suddenly felt like an outcast. He felt his personal space narrowing, as though he had been suddenly divided into two parts. One for those who didn't belong to the elite, and the other for those who were inherently meant to be rejected. How is this even possible, he thought. I'm just an ordinary person like everyone else. I'm not asking for attention. I didn't come here as a star, but as just a person who wants to have dinner. But something in this restaurant wasn't right. This rejection wasn't just a coincidence. It was a moment when they looked him in the face and said, "You don't belong in this world," and he realized he couldn't just walk away. Keanu finally approached the waiter, who stood before him with such an impassive expression, as if he were completely unaffected by any emotion. Keanu felt his hands clench slightly into fists, and his breathing became heavy. "Why?" Keanu whispered, unable to stop himself from trying to understand what had led to such a rejection. The waiter, seemingly not noticing his confusion, repeated, "It's our policy. We don't serve celebrities." These words sounded as though they meant nothing to the waiter, but for Keanu they became crucial. "But am I not just a person like everyone else?" he thought. He felt each word disappear into emptiness, unanswered, as if there were entirely different realities in the world, and he just didn't exist in this one. In that moment, Keanu felt his gaze begin to deepen. He understood that something greater was happening here. His attention was drawn to the strange atmosphere, its coldness and alienation. It seemed like everyone here was part of a carefully constructed game, and Keanu found himself on the wrong side. He tried to lift his head, to look around and find some explanation for what was happening, but their eyes were empty. They looked at him, not expecting an answer, as if they knew that his rejection was just natural. There was no sympathy. There was no interest. They simply observed, and his life turned into a television screen where everything happening was no longer his own. Keanu couldn't find himself in this. The more he tried to comprehend what was happening, the colder he felt. He stood in the center of the room, like in a cage surrounded by gazes and whispers. This was not just social rejection. This was a rejection not only of his fame, but of him as a person. Keanu knew that in the world, there would always be those who find a reason for exceptions, who decide who is worthy to be among them and who is not. And he had become the one they decided to exclude. And at that moment, he suddenly realized that no status, No success could protect him from this. His identity, his past achievements, his good deeds, all of that didn't matter when a wall was put up before him by people who decided that he was not worthy. At some point, Keanu felt that his own accomplishments had become an obstacle to simply being a person among people. He had become a pitiful spectacle in this strange world. Keanu tried to ask what was behind this rejection, but the waiter just shrugged. "It's the administration's decision," he said, as if that was all that needed to be known. Keanu looked at the waiter once more, trying to figure out if he was joking, if he was hiding some important information, but the waiter's face remained stone cold and indifferent. Keanu felt his last attempts to understand the situation slip away. Then do I just not exist? It seemed as though he was screaming inside himself, but he didn't know how to respond anymore. In this situation, all questions seemed unnecessary. He was so deeply shocked that he couldn't find the words to express what he felt. At some point, Keanu realized that the situation wouldn't change. He stood in the hall surrounded by silence and stares. People continued to watch him like a living piece of art. But this wasn't art. It was a show where he had been cast not as a hero, but as an object for discussion. The stares and whispers kept going. Expectations, accusations, reactions. He was part of this game, but now he didn't understand how to escape it. His status was no longer his strength. He had suddenly become part of insecurity, doubt, and rejection. This moment had opened his eyes to the fact that fame isn't always something that provides support. Sometimes it becomes a burden that you carry without realizing how easily it can destroy everything you thought you were. Keanu slowly turned and walked toward the exit. He didn't know what awaited him. What would he do with this new realization? He was lost in thought, understanding that the rejection in the restaurant had become more than just an act of social isolation. It was a blow to his worldview, to his confidence that everything he had done had meaning. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. That moment had made him reflect on many things. On the world that, until then, seemed open, accessible, and just. On a world where his fame should have been part of his advantages, not a weapon against which he was powerless. After leaving the encounter with the waiter, Keanu's mind was boiling with guesses and confusion. He didn't know what to do with the rejection. He didn't know how to react to what had happened. But one thing was clear. Something was deeply wrong in that restaurant. There was something cold and unsettling in the waiter's face, as if this refusal had been premeditated, as if it were part of some game. Keanu understood that he needed to find out the truth, but how? Where could he find answers to the questions that wouldn't leave him in peace? He raised his gaze to the guests who were still staring at him, but without the respect and curiosity that had always accompanied him before. He noticed how some continued filming on their phones, and some even tried to do it discreetly. For them, it had become some kind of show. No matter how much Keanu tried, he couldn't ignore that his status had become part of their entertainment. He was no more than an exhibit, labeled not for service. But what was behind this rejection? He knew he had to figure it out, or it would torment him. The realization that his being ignored wasn't a coincidence, but part of some game wouldn't let him rest. He decided to talk to the manager. The internal conflict had escalated to its peak, but Keanu understood that if he wanted to restore justice, he had to act. He made his way toward the door leading to the office, and there he was, finally standing before the door. It was a simple wooden doorway, completely unremarkable, but here, in this room, as he felt, was where the whole truth was hidden. Keanu paused for a moment, gathering his strength before knocking. He was ready for any conversation, ready to once and for all get an explanation for everything that had happened. He was ready for any truth, but he wasn't ready for what was to come. When the door opened, he was greeted by a middle-aged man in a dark gray suit. He appeared serene, almost too calm for someone who could be at the center of such a conflict. "How can I help?" he asked. But there was something in his eyes that made Keanu feel that he already knew what this was about. "I want to understand what's going on," Keanu said, trying to stay composed. "Why can't I be served at this restaurant?" The manager nodded silently and invited him in. At first, nothing was said, except for the soft footsteps down the hallway. Keanu felt the tension building, the strange silence in the air growing heavier. He tried to make sense of the office. looking for any clues that could explain what was happening, but everything appeared normal. There were no signs of anything unusual hiding here. When they entered the office, the manager gestured for him to sit, but Keanu didn't. He stood across from the desk, which was cluttered with folders and documents, but nothing seemed important in that moment. The manager, unhurried, sat at the desk and began to speak. First, I want to explain. Everything that happened wasn't a mistake. We've decided to change our service policy a bit. This wasn't a coincidence or a personal choice of the waiter. This decision was made by our company at the highest level. Keanu seemed to start understanding what had been going on, but he still couldn't believe it. He felt that they weren't giving him all the information. But then the manager continued. We started running an experiment, he said. It was a marketing move to attract attention to our restaurant. Refusing to serve celebrities is part of the new policy. We aim to be exclusive and attract attention. It works for our reputation. The manager's words hit Keanu like thunder on a clear day. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This restaurant, which had once been a symbol of exclusivity and respect, was now nothing more than part of a marketing game. Keanu felt his chest tighten from the strain. How can you do this to people? He almost whispered. You're building a business on offense and humiliation. This is not respect. This is manipulation. The manager's expression didn't change. He looked at Keanu with a slight sense of sympathy, but there was no regret in his eyes. We've created a culture where every guest feels valuable and special. Exclusivity attracts attention, and we become those whom people want to see. Keanu felt anger rising inside him, but at the same time, he couldn't help but realize one thing. This system wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate move, developed in the finest details. He suddenly understood that the refusal to serve him was only part of a much broader scheme. The restaurant not only made people feel rejected, but it also created an atmosphere in which everyone, even stars, became mere pawns in their game. Then the manager added one more sentence that completely shook Keanu. We use this event to raise the restaurant's reputation and attract attention on social media. Every refusal became another opportunity to make a statement. Keanu, feeling everything inside him shattering, asked, So you deceive people? Manipulate their feelings for profit? The manager looked at him with a barely noticeable smile and said, This isn't deception, Keanu. It's just business. People love to be part of something exclusive. We're just giving them what they want. Keanu felt his eyes darken with outrage. He never could have imagined encountering such cynicism. This restaurant had become not just a place to dine, but a real factory of manipulation, where people's feelings and expectations had become merchandise. He felt his self-respect crushing him as he realized that he had been part of this mechanism. Keanu stood up and walked to the door, saying no more words. He was stunned, but at the same time, he was determined to understand how this experience would affect his life. In that moment, he didn't know what to do next. But he knew one thing for certain. In this world, things are not always as they seem, and everything he knew about his status and fame suddenly turned out to be not so valuable after all. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, and he once again felt the stares of people. But now these stares were not just observations. They were part of a game in which every person had become an instrument for achieving a goal. Keanu realized that this world could be much colder and more calculating than he had ever thought. Keanu stood in the office, stunned by what he had heard. He didn't know what to do with this revelation, but it hit him like a lightning strike. The restaurant, which had always been a symbol of sophistication, had now become part of a closed loop of manipulation. This was no longer just a refusal to serve. It was a carefully thought-out strategy, hidden behind a mask of elegance. Seeing that Keanu couldn't recover from the shock, the manager continued explaining. Keanu, with his experience and intuition, realized that the hidden truth about the restaurant was not only unpleasant, but also a threat to a society that had grown accustomed to trusting such establishments. This wasn't just a marketing move. It was a violation of the basic principles of human dignity, exploiting people's unconscious weaknesses. It was destroying the reputation of restaurants as public spaces, where people didn't just eat, but also felt like part of something more significant. The manager continued to explain that the very idea of refusal had been inspired by many modern advertising strategies that use the element of controversy to go viral. By being at the center of a heated discussion, The restaurant planned to gain massive attention on social media, where conflict and debate became key elements of viral content. Scandals are the best way to attract attention, the manager said, as if repeating the mantra of an advertising guru who always knew how to manipulate people's emotions. Keanu was trying to comprehend how it could have come to the point where his own status was nothing more than part of an algorithm designed to attract culinary fans and news-hungry followers. You're building this whole process on people, on their feelings, on their egos. This is more than just manipulation, he said, trying to grasp the scale of what was happening. The manager, with a light smile on his face, shrugged. People always want more. They want exclusivity. They want to be part of something significant, and we give them that. We don't manipulate their feelings. We provide them with what they want. Our job is to give them what they don't even realize they're looking for. Keanu couldn't believe his ears. Everything about this seemed so dirty and dishonest. He realized that this wasn't just a private strategy of one restaurant. It was possibly a trend that was gaining popularity in the industry. He remembered how the guests in the restaurant behaved when he first walked in. They were like in a zoo, watching an animal in a cage. His status had become their entertainment, and his human qualities had been reduced to just part of the show. I can't believe this is happening, and that you're doing this to people, Keanu said, feeling his anger grow. He was no longer just a bewildered person. He had become a participant in a system that was undermining the foundations of human dignity. The restaurant used those who had always been adored, turning them into toys for the masses. And worst of all, people not only accepted it, but supported it. When Keanu asked how he could be sure that this wasn't a coincidence, the manager revealed the details of how the system worked. Once inside the entire process, Keanu realized that the refusal was only part of a much more complex system. The restaurant wasn't just a place for dinner. It was part of a business model that turned people into markers, public figures, playing in a system of love and hate. He learned that the restaurant chain was hiding a vast number of these experiments. With each refusal of service, the number of likes and comments increased, and the news about the refusals became a topic of discussion on television and social media. This brought a huge boost in attention and advertising benefits. But this effect was only temporary. Once it became clear to society that this was manipulation, public opinion began to shift, and the restaurant experienced a decline. Keanu was struck by how well this mechanism was set up. It wasn't a mistake. It was a carefully planned business strategy. But Keanu also realized that all of this was too foolish to be effective in the long term. On the outside, the restaurant seemed attractive. But now Keanu could see that behind the facade lay a troubled, cold world. He began to think about how small gestures, like refusing service, could ruin a person's reputation and drive them to the abyss. He realized that these restaurants themselves were creating something dangerous for entire communities with their reputation. They were destroying what had made them successful. They had become not just places to eat, but part of those very troubling marketing games. The manager continued speaking. We're sure that our guests like this. It attracts them. It makes them feel part of something great and unattainable. We live in a world where what matters is not who you are, but how you perceive yourself. And you think all this will always work? Keanu asked. The manager didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, looked at Keanu and said, I don't know, but if we don't try, we'll never know. With every word, it became clearer to Keanu. The restaurant was more than just a place for dinner. It was part of a new era of manipulation, created to blur the lines between reality and advertising. And, most frighteningly, it was part of a system where human emotions were just tools for creating trends. For Keanu, this was not just disappointment, it was a mind-shattering revelation. But in this revelation, there was something profoundly human. He understood that society had long stopped valuing sincerity and was instead seeking ways to create something out of nothing, to be part of something that, in reality, didn't exist. He stood up and walked toward the door. Everything he knew about himself, the world, and people seemed to be under threat. As he walked out, he felt that his status no longer mattered. It was like a moment of clarity, a moment when you realize that not only have you lost hope for honesty, but also the realization that it was all, in fact, an illusion. A few days later, Keanu Reeves couldn't understand what was happening. Information about his refusal of service at the restaurant spread across news feeds, social media, and even television. It was like a virus. Soon, various memes and posts appeared, raising the topic of bias and injustice in an industry that seemed to be an example of kindness and respect. The attention to this scandal was overwhelming. Within a few hours, hundreds of thousands of people began expressing their opinions about what had happened. Keanu himself was shocked by the scale of it, but it became clear to him that this was not just a coincidence or a wave of negativity, it was a new form of social reaction. Words like a snowball were rolling across the internet, and unexpected conclusions began to emerge. Twitter, Instagram, and even news channels started showing a powerful wave of outrage. Supporters of Keanu Reeves and those who wanted to talk about personal freedom and the right to fair service raised their voices. Look at what we've become. No one wants to be humiliated, even if you're a superstar, some users said. But the most interesting thing was that this wave of protest grew so strong that restaurants started publicly apologizing. On one of the popular news websites, there was an article calling on restaurant managers, "It's time to think. Respect for the person is more important than status." Along with this text, there were vibrant posts supporting the values of honesty and respect in public places. And then, a couple of days after the incident, something stunning happened at the restaurant that had refused to serve Keanu. A huge banner appeared at the main entrance reading, "We don't disrespect celebrities." Strange, right? The entire restaurant was shaken by this gesture. But unlike other similar incidents, this banner became not just an advertisement, but an apology. The public was outraged, but at the same time, they couldn't help but notice the restaurant's attempt to distance itself from its actions. They were trying to look like heroes, which only angered society even more. Keanu looked at this banner, and there was no joy or satisfaction in his eyes. He realized that the restaurant, under pressure from public opinion, was trying to turn the situation in its favor. But as soon as they started apologizing to him, it meant that they hadn't really changed their stance. They were simply looking for a way to get off the hook. Keanu's reaction to the whole situation was complex. On one hand, his outrage was justified, as he felt he had been deceived and used in an unfair game. On the other hand, he was grateful for the wave of support that had turned in his favor. It gave him a chance to feel that there was still room for justice in the world. But what was most interesting was that Keanu realized the scandal had become more than just his personal trial. It had become a symbol of how public opinion could influence the system. The situation with the restaurant proved that even the strongest and most respected person could face injustice, but that injustice could be dismantled by the power of mass discontent. And it was through this public power that the restaurant was forced to take action. However, Keanu knew that there was something more behind this than just an apology for the incident. In fact, the entire scandal had become a golden ticket for the restaurant to new profits. The adopted course of acknowledging the mistake was part of a new game that they were forced to play. Over time, attention to the incident only increased. The media began publishing articles that delved into the depth of the conflict, its social significance, and moral aspects. One major news channel, the first to publish an article about the scandal, conducted a full interview with a marketing expert who explained how restaurants manipulate their customers' attention. "The principle of refuse to attract has been used in business for a long time," the expert said. However, in the case of a public figure like Keanu Reeves, the effect was much stronger. This phrase spread across news agencies and added another layer of understanding to what had happened. Although society had split into two camps, those who supported the restaurant and those who considered its actions immoral, other celebrities began to voice their opinions about the incident. Some supported Keanu, stating that refusing service to celebrities was a clear violation of their rights, while others argued that the restaurant had the right to choose whom to serve. However, among all these famous individuals, one phrase truly shocked the public. Tom Hanks, one of the most respected figures in Hollywood, wrote on his personal social media account, "We used to be here to serve people. Now we've all become part of the game." This phrase was taken as a reminder from the past, highlighting that respect and dignity are what truly matter in relationships between people. And then, just as the situation seemed to die down, an unexpected offer came in. One of the popular restaurants in the city, which had never been involved in such a scandal, invited Keanu for a free dinner. This was not just an invitation. It was a public apology that the restaurant was willing to take responsibility for. Keanu was pleasantly surprised. The entire city followed the development of this offer, and at that moment, the public was once again impressed by how sincerity and respect could change the perception of a situation. But there was more. The restaurant that invited Keanu declared that they were always happy to welcome people regardless of their status, and that they prided themselves on making every customer feel important. The climax came when Keanu, after several days of reflection, made a public statement that he would not visit the restaurant that had refused him service, even if they offered him an apology. He said that he wanted to see the restaurant change its policy, not just try to wriggle out of the situation. The entire city was shocked by this statement. Keanu had become not just a victim of a misunderstanding, but a symbol of the fight for justice, and his decision not to compromise became his strongest move. As it turned out, Keanu Reeves was not the first to be ignored. Soon after his visit, the restaurant became the subject of mass criticism, and not only because Keanu was a celebrity, but because his refusal of service became a moment that exploded on social media. Then, unexpectedly, Keanu received an offer from another restaurant, which not only offered him a free dinner, but also publicly apologized to him, stating that they were always happy to welcome people, regardless of their status. But the most surprising event happened later. At the restaurant that had refused him service, a huge banner appeared with the words, "In our restaurant, celebrities are not disrespected." And this message made the entire public reconsider their views on status and respect.